The man my girlfriend compared me to for 2 years couldn't remember her name at the club. That was what I learned after she told me. If I want to go clubbing with my ex, I will. You don't get a say. I didn't fight. I left the keys on the counter and let her choose him. 6 months later, she cornered me at a cafe for closure and realized I wasn't the one still waiting. I'm 28. I work in logistics, coordination, scheduling, making sure orders and equipment get where they need to be, on time. Steady income. Consistent hours, not the kind of job that impresses anyone at a dinner party, but I was fine with that. I've always been someone who shows up when he says he will and does what he says he's going to do. Qley had her own apartment. Nicer than anything I could have reasonably managed at that point. I had a key. I kept a spare set of clothes in her closet and was there 5 nights out of 7 most weeks. We'd been together just over 2 years. The first 18 months were real. She was sharp, social, quick to read a room, good at getting into an argument without letting it matter the next morning. We made plans, not dramatic ones, just the small, specific kind that assume you'll both still be around in 6 months. An apartment we'd talked about finding together. A trip we'd been loosely planning since January. The kind of plans that feel more serious than declarations because they don't need a speech. I believed in what we were building. Mark's name first came up in October. He was her ex they'd dated briefly a couple of years before she and I got together. She mentioned he'd come back into her social circle. Reconnecting with old friends, she said. I didn't press it. But the name kept coming up. His apartment in a better part of the city. His car. The way he handled things without overthinking them. He's the kind of person who just figures things out, she said once. Each mention was light, offhand. But they all ran in the same direction. There was one thing she said about 5 months before the kitchen that I should have taken more seriously. We were talking about something small I can't even place now. And she said, Mark never needed to know where I was. Not an attack. Not the start of a fight. Just a preference she was stating. Like something she'd found valuable in that arrangement and still missed. I nodded. I actually nodded. I should not have done that. At the time I told myself it was the kind of comparison people make out of habit. I gave it the most charitable reading I could find. That wasn't the accurate reading. She told me on a Thursday evening. She wanted to go out with Mark. Just the two of them, to a club he knew. A night out. Reconnecting, she said. I didn't say no. I didn't tell her she couldn't go. I didn't issue any kind of ultimatum. I started to ask one question, something like, can we just take a minute to talk about this? And I didn't finish it. She put her hand up. Not aggressive. Just final. The way you close a conversation before it opens, when you've already decided you're not interested in what's about to come out of someone's mouth. Then she said it. If I want to go clubbing with my ex, I will. You don't get a say. That's what freedom is. She said it the way you'd explain a policy. Calm. Clear. Like my asking a question was the strange part. I went quiet. Not the quiet before a fight, something different. The kind of quiet that settles when you've understood something clearly for the first time, and the understanding is not what you were hoping for. I picked up my jacket. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't ask her to clarify or take it back. I didn't give her anything to respond to. I walked to the door and I left. I sat in my car in her parking lot for a while. Not fuming. Not building a speech. Just sitting with what had been said, turning it over. Then I went back. She was already gone out for the night. I let myself in with my key. I went to her kitchen, found a piece of scrap paper on the counter, and wrote 3 words on it. Enjoy your freedom. I folded it once and set it down. Then I placed the key next to it. Her key, the one she'd given me 18 months ago. The first time she'd offered a spare. I stood there and looked at both of them on the counter. 3 words and a piece of metal. Then I walked out. The door closed behind me. Not a slam. Just a door completing its arc. I drove home. I didn't go back. She wouldn't find it until the next morning. The days after were quiet in a way I hadn't expected. I'd braced for something immediate to call that night. A confrontation, something. But when I checked my phone the next morning, there was nothing yet. So, I went to work. Came home. Made my own dinner. Sat with it. And in that quiet, I went back through things. The way you do when something finally gives you permission to look at the full picture instead of each piece in isolation. The apartment. His car. The lifestyle observations she'd been making for months, each one small enough to dismiss on its own, but all running in the same direction. They weren't random comments. They were a comparison that had been going since October. I'd been reading each moment as a standalone thing instead of seeing what they added up to. I thought about the word controlling. She'd used it a handful of times over the past year. Not often enough to start a recurring argument, just often enough to do a specific job. Whenever I expressed a preference about a weekend, or asked about a plan, or said I'd rather not go somewhere. "There you go, being controlling again," said lightly. Sometimes with a small laugh, like I was being unnecessarily complicated and she was the patient one. I'd adjusted for that word. Quietly, without fully tracking what I was doing, I'd started reviewing sentences before I said them. Started conversations differently than I'd meant to. Let things go I hadn't actually wanted to let go. Decided a preference of mine wasn't worth whatever came after I mentioned it. I'd been editing myself down for a year. I'd been calling it being easy to be with. And then there was what she'd said about Mark. He never needed to know where I was. Standing in my own kitchen now, I read that line differently than I had when she'd first said it. She hadn't been describing something she'd moved past. She'd been describing something she still wanted. Mark didn't ask. Mark didn't check in. Mark gave her space to go wherever she went without making it a conversation. And somewhere in that comparison, Alex was the problem. She'd been testing limits for a while. I'd been too willing to treat each test as a single incident, isolated from all the others. The kitchen line wasn't a slip. It wasn't a bad night or a moment of frustration she'd regret. It was what she actually believed, said easily, and without hesitation because she'd had reason to believe it for a long time. She just never had to say it directly until I asked a question she didn't want to answer. I was the last one to find out. I found out what happened on her end secondhand, because Jess told me. Jess was a mutual friend, someone both Qley and I had known before we started dating. She reached out about a week after I'd left, just to check in. I kept it brief, said we were done and I wasn't looking to get into it. She respected that, but she was still talking to Qley. When Qley came home the next morning and found the note and the key, her first text to Jess was, "He actually left. I can't believe him." Not, "What did I say?" Not, "Do you think I was out of line?" Just, "What he did." The emphasis falling entirely on my behavior. By the end of that week, the account had taken shape. According to Jess, who told me all of this much later, Qley's version went roughly like this. Alex had always been a little too jealous. He couldn't handle her having male friendships, especially with anyone from her past. She'd wanted to spend a night out with an old friend, and rather than having a real conversation, Alex had given her a choice, her social life for him. When she'd stood her ground, he'd walked out. She'd done nothing wrong. He'd just proven he wasn't capable of being in a relationship with someone who had her own life. No mention of the line, "No, you don't get a say." No, that's what freedom is. Just what Alex had done afterward. She'd been very precise about which parts of the story she was including. Jess had believed her. Of course she had. She'd only had one version, and it held together. It made me sound like a man who couldn't handle being told no, who'd walked out when a woman refused to back down. I didn't reach out to correct it. I had no interest in building a competing account. I wasn't going to call mutual contacts and explain what had actually been said. I wasn't going to invest energy in being believed by people whose opinion I wasn't going to need. But in that same period, Qley was also texting me directly, not asking what had gone wrong, not saying she thought she might have handled it badly. The first message was, "Seriously, Alex." 2 days later, "Are you really doing this right now?" Then, "This is ridiculous." Not once did any of those messages ask what she might have said that had hurt me, which told me something. The version she was giving Jess wasn't a story she'd constructed afterward to save face. It was what she actually believed about what had happened. It was how she'd read the situation from the beginning. Then the voicemails. The first whats came about a week in. Tone. Mildly dismissive, slightly impatient. "Are you seriously not talking to me over this? Come on, Alex." Like I was being dramatic about something minor, I would eventually get over it. I didn't respond. Week 2, the tone shifted. "You need to talk to me about this. I'm serious. This isn't something you just don't respond to." Then another, harder. "I'm not going to keep waiting here while you decide to be an adult about it." Still nothing. By week 3, she'd started pulling in the outside world. "I've talked to people about this. Everyone thinks you're being completely unreasonable. You can't just make a unilateral decision like this and disappear." And then the one that stood apart from all the others. "I said what I said, but that doesn't mean you get to just disappear. That's not how this works. I said what I said." She wasn't confused about what had happened. She wasn't claiming the line had been misunderstood or taken out of context. She knew exactly what she'd said. She just didn't believe it gave me the right to leave. She told me I had no say. And she'd also decided I had no exit. Both of those things were supposed to be true at the same time. She wanted my presence without my voice. She wanted me to stay in the relationship she'd defined, under the terms she'd set, with no input from me about what those terms were. And my silence, apparently, was the proof that I was being unreasonable. 22 messages over 21 days. I didn't respond to one. Around that same time, I ran into Mike at the gym, a guy I've known from there for a couple of years, goes out a fair amount, knows people around the city. We were wrapping up a session and talking about nothing in particular when he mentioned he'd been at that same club on that same night, a few months back. Said he'd seen Mark there, left around midnight with the woman he'd come with. I mentioned Qley's name. Said she'd been there too. Mike paused for a moment. Huh. I actually mentioned her to him once afterward, just in passing, and he barely reacted. I don't think he even knew they'd been in the same place that night. I didn't say much in response. We finished up and went our separate ways. But on the drive home, I sat with it. She'd spent 3 weeks leaving voicemails about a night that wasn't even what she'd thought it was. The trust fund ex. The person she'd been measuring me against for the better part of a year. The reason she'd concluded I was too present, too vocal, too interested in knowing where she was. He hadn't retained her name clearly enough to recall it in casual conversation a few months later. I didn't enjoy knowing that. It wasn't satisfying the way I might have expected. It just completed the picture. After the last voicemail, I sat down and listened to all of them, start to finish, not to punish myself, not to keep a wound open. I just wanted to go through the complete record before I made a permanent decision. I wanted to have heard everything clearly before I moved. So I listened to every single one. The dismissive early ones, the demanding middle ones, the ones with social pressure behind them, the one that said I said what I said. I went through the texts in order. I let each message register. Then I put my phone down on the table, and I made one decision. I went into my contacts, found her name, and blocked it. No message before I did it. No final word, no announcement. I just did it quietly, the way you close something that's been open longer than it should have been. The screen didn't change dramatically. Nothing happened. It was just done. The best way I've found to describe that moment is this: the click of finality. Not a sound, there was no sound. Just the internal sensation of something that had been held partly open being allowed to close. A door I'd been keeping just slightly ajar, without any particular reason, and then I simply let it go. After that, the evenings felt different. I stopped tracking what time I was supposed to be somewhere. I stopped reviewing sentences before I said them out loud. I stopped filling in the quiet to manage something that wasn't in the room anymore. I made plans without running them past anyone else first. Small things. Ordinary things. Mine. I didn't think about Qley much. When I did, it wasn't with anger or grief, just the quiet awareness of an absence. Like reaching for something on a shelf and finding it gone, and not particularly minding that it's gone. I started going to the cafe on Sundays, just to have somewhere that was consistently mine and consistently good. The evenings were quiet. I was fine. About 6 months later, I was at my regular Sunday cafe. I'd been going there most weekends since January. Same table by the window when it's free. Same order. Sometimes I bring something to read. Sometimes I just sit with the coffee and let the morning go. Good spot. Consistently good. That Sunday was warm. More light through the windows than most Sundays. I was maybe halfway through my coffee, not thinking about anything in particular, when the door opened. Jess walked in. Qley was with her. I saw Qley see me. It happened fast. Her eyes moved across the room as she came through the door and landed on me and stopped. Half a second. Not dramatic. Just real. She said something to Jess. Jess looked over at me briefly. I didn't look away. Qley made a decision and walked toward my table. Jess stayed near the door. Qley stopped in front of me and said my name. I looked up at her. And I want to be precise about what I felt in that moment, because I think the accuracy matters. Nothing. Not anger. Not residual grief. Not the low-level discomfort of running into someone you'd rather not see. I looked at her the way you'd look at a former coworker you recognize but don't actually know well. That mild, slightly unfocused acknowledgement of someone who was once in your world and no longer is. She said, "We should talk." I said, "I hope you're well." She paused. Recalibrated. "Alex, we were together for 2 years. I know how long we were together." She tried practical. Can we have a conversation about what actually happened? You just disappeared. I think we both know what happened. She shifted to guilt. You never gave me a chance to explain anything. You just shut me out completely. I didn't respond to that one. She reached for history. A specific trip we'd taken, something she clearly remembered well. Something that had been genuinely good between us. I let her finish. I didn't dispute it had been real. It just wasn't a reason to reopen something I'd already closed. She tried one more angle, something like, you could at least tell me you've thought about it, and I said nothing. Then, she said, do you even care? I looked at her for a moment. I think we've both had the freedom we were looking for. She didn't have a response to that. I watched her go through what was left and find nothing. The hook she'd been counting on, some trace of residual care she could work with, something to reach into, wasn't there. No argument. No hurt she could negotiate with. No opening. She stepped back. Said something quiet. I think it ended with okay then. She went back to Jess. They found a table on the other side of the room. I didn't look over again. I sat there a little longer than usual after that. Not to recover. Not to process. The coffee was still warm, and the morning was quiet, and I had nowhere to be. I just sat. I want to be honest about what that felt like. Because I think it matters to say it correctly, it didn't feel like winning. It didn't feel like the scene I'd been building toward for 6 months. It felt like verification, confirmation that what I'd been feeling since January, the quiet and the not missing it and the actual okayness, was real. Not a posture I'd been maintaining, just where I actually was. Jess had been near the door the entire time. Close enough to have seen every approach and every response. She'd heard Qley's version of events for 6 months, the jealous boyfriend, the one who'd issued an ultimatum and run when he didn't get his way. That story, told by someone who had every reason to believe it. And she'd just watched something that didn't match any of it. I paid for my coffee. I walked out. Same as any other Sunday. That evening, Jess texted me. I've been hearing her version for 6 months. I get it now. 11 words. I read it once. I typed back, thank you. Then I put my phone on the kitchen counter and went back to what I'd been doing. I didn't follow up. Didn't ask Jess what she planned to say or do with that. Didn't fill her in on anything she hadn't already seen for herself. She'd been in the room. She'd watched the whole thing from 3 feet away. That was enough. The false narrative, the jealous, controlling boyfriend who'd abandoned someone for asserting herself had run out of its one reliable audience. Narratives like that only hold when the person receiving them has no access to anything else. Jess no longer had that limitation. Mark, according to Mike, had moved out of the city a few months after that night. Took a job elsewhere. Left without making an announcement about it. Nobody I talked to seemed particularly surprised. The voicemails had stopped long before the cafe. The texts had stopped. A few mutual contacts had reached out at various points with some version of she's going through a hard time, maybe just reach out, and then stopped reaching out when I didn't respond. Those threads die when nothing comes back. The silence becomes the answer without anyone having to explain anything. I've thought about the note since. 3 words on a folded piece of paper. Enjoy your freedom. She'd used that word to close a conversation I was trying to open. I handed it back to her, intact. Not as a jab. Just literally. She told me what she wanted. I gave it to her. The key I think about less. That part was just practical. I still go to that cafe most Sundays. Same table when it's free, same coffee. Qley hasn't been back, as far as I know. I don't think about her often. When I do, there's not much weight to it. Something that happened. Something that, in the end, said exactly what it needed to say about itself without any competing version I had to maintain, without any performance I had to keep up. She got her freedom. I got mine. The difference is, I never had to tell anyone they had no say to get it.